of the Filipino Language and Culture Program. He earned his on PhD in Second Language Studies from the University of Hawaii, and his research interests include heritage language education, language ideologies, multi
Um, there's no audio po.
features of Southeast Asian languages. And so, help me welcome our speaker, Dr. Jason Parva.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Aloha maayo buntag. Is it buntag in the Philippines? All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Hello? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes,
Doc,
sir.
we can hear you po.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm Jason, and the title of my presentation is Beyond Boundaries, Challenging Monolingual Norms through Multilingual Students' Linguistic Resources. So I'd like to begin by saying I'm actually from Mindanao. I grew up in Bukidnon, so kabalo ko magbisaya, kaayo, bisda kaayo ko. So if you guys have questions later, please do ask questions. You may ask questions in Cebuano, in Tagalog, Filipino, or in English. So many of you are probably also language majors. I was actually an English major back in college, and also when I did my master's, and even for my PhD, I did a PhD in applied linguistics or second language studies here in the US. So I would like to begin by sharing that my talk will take you to another dimension of language policy and also linguistic experiences, right? Because the focus of my talk is basically heritage language education, which is basically teaching Filipino language and culture outside the Philippines. And many of you probably are not aware that Filipino is actually being taught across the world, right? So later I'm going to show you a list of universities that are teaching Filipino out in the US and also in Japan. And again, I'm drawing from these experiences as an English teacher back in the Philippines and connecting that with my own experience here teaching Philippine language and culture and also social linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So to begin, I have this student who works in the healthcare here in Hawaii. And she said, a patient who recently immigrated from the Philippines required surgical intervention. Since she shared a similar cultural and language background, our communication was enhanced by speaking Filipino and by building connections with the patient's families, right? So these are some of the things that many of members of the audience probably don't know. But one of the things that you will perhaps experience when you go to the US or other parts of the world is to actually access healthcare, right? And healthcare or health services in that country or host country is actually done usually in the dominant language of this country. So even if I'm highly proficient in English, I'd like to believe that I'm highly proficient in English, I still struggle with this sometimes, right? English can be very daunting, especially in the healthcare industry, because you have to talk to your doctor in English and describe things, what you're feeling, the kind of like symptoms that you have in English, right? To make sure that they actually get it correctly. But this particular student is saying that speaking to them in Filipino help reduce fear and confusion, address their questions, and address their concerns. The connection we formed allowed the patient's family to see the patient not only as someone who needs treatment, but as a person navigating the complex health system under challenging circumstances. So you probably heard that in many spaces, especially in the US, English is expected, right? But in the context of Hawaii, there's a lot of Filipinos here. Around 25% of the population are Filipinos. So you can imagine 1 out of 4 people in Hawaii, right, are Filipinos. So that's actually a big majority of the population. And so the language is quite present, is well represented, not only in education, but also even in the healthcare industry, in education, and in many parts of the industries here in Hawaii. So I would like to share this because this is an example of translanguaging where a person draws from his or her linguistic resources in order to connect with the patient, right? Because they speak Filipino in this particular case, right? And because of this, this connection makes the person even even more willing to share and actually access healthcare services in such a manner that again for them feels safe, right? So this is something very important. However, I would like to go back to this very important concept of linguistic insecurity. Many of us who learn English or Tagalog-based Filipino as a second or third language or as an additional language experience linguistic insecurity. And why is this, right? According to the scholar Francois Grosjean, who says many bilinguals have a tendency to evaluate their language competencies as inadequate. And this is actually true. Many of us have this, evaluation, negative evaluation of our own language practices or language proficiency. And some criticize their mastery of language skills. Others strive their hardest to reach monolingual norms. Others still hide their knowledge of their weaker language. And some of us do this as well. And most simply do not perceive themselves as being bilingual, even though they use two or more languages regularly. And in the context of Mindanao, for instance, many of us are multilinguals, right? We speak Cebuano, we speak Hiligaynon, we speak Maranao, and many other languages. And yet some of us actually hide our multilingual identities. And it has something to do also with this linguistic insecurity. And the question is, how do people develop a sense of linguistic insecurity? Why does that happen? According to Lourdes Ortega, who's a big figure in the field of second language acquisition, one of the reasons why linguistic insecurity happens is because many of us in the Philippines and many other contexts, we have likened language learning, whether that is English or Filipino or Cebuano, we have likened language learning to a ladder of success, right? So it seems like a ladder that we have to climb. And for us to be confident and, be respected, we have constructed this native-like high proficiency. So many of us wanted to receive or achieve the native-like proficiency, as if, again, language learning is linear, when in fact the process is actually more complex than that. And so we have these different ideologies. For instance, in many universities in the Philippines, we have target language only policy. If it's an English class, we have to speak only in English. If it's a Filipino class, you have to speak only in Filipino. Again, very monolingual oriented, right? And also we have professionalism that's often tied to the standard language, be it in English or standard Filipino. Again, we think that a non-standard language is not respectable, right? And therefore should not be welcome in spaces that require professionalism. We also have language shaming, and language shaming is very common in the Philippines. And I guess many of you understand what I mean by that, right? There's a lot of people mocking other people's accent, for instance, is a very common practice in the Philippines. We're so obsessive with corrective pedagogy as well. Like some teachers often interrupt or correct students, which actually really create linguistic insecurity because the students eventually internalize that they're committing a lot of mistakes and errors, and they will never achieve native-like proficiency, right? Because of this corrective pedagogy, so obsessed with correctness, standard language, neutral or if not desirable pronunciation. I remember taking a speech class in college where the goal was to actually cleanse our pronunciation so that we almost sound like a native speaker. So I went to Xavier University at Ateneo de Cagayan, and as an English teacher, a pre-service teacher, we had speech classes. I remember that. And then when I became a teacher, I also kind of adopted that perspective. And then I realized that it's really very wrong, right? Because again, it's a way of language shaming, or creating this ideology that only American English is acceptable or desirable English. And so I would like to then bring you to a different context, right? So the question is, does this also occur, like language shaming, native speakerism, and this idea of language learning as a ladder? Does this also occur in heritage language contexts? When I say heritage language is when a student or a learner is learning the language of their parents. Let's say immigrant students in Dubai, right? And they're learning Filipino in Dubai. Or more broadly, among younger generations learning Filipino across the diaspora? What if Filipino Americans are learning Filipino across the diaspora? Do they also experience language shaming, linguistic hierarchy, right? And if not, how do native speakerism and unequal multilingualism manifest in Filipino language and culture programs worldwide? So I'm going to take you out of the Philippines. So please join me in this journey. And hopefully it will, of course, arouse your interest, because my experience as an English teacher in the Philippines is very different with teaching Filipino and Philippine culture classes here at the University of Hawaii, which is, we have a lot of Filipino American students or Filipino locals in the context of Hawaii. So we know that, the language of the official language of the Philippines is English and Filipino being the national language, which was, of course, created through Tagalog-based Filipino. Okay. Just a heads up, everybody. My medicine is being delivered. I might have to exit for a bit, sir. And also, I apologize that I have an important medication. But yeah, so I just wanted to emphasize that Filipino is often taught as a national language wherever you are in the world, right? Rooted in Tagalog. But diaspora Filipinos, when I say diaspora Filipinos, these are Filipinos who are living outside the Philippines. We're talking about Filipinos living in Hong Kong, Filipinos living in Japan, right, in Australia and Canada, and also here in Hawaii. So again, their lives are very multilingual, and also they have to negotiate translocal realities because they're no longer just Filipinos in the homeland, like in the Philippines, but are actually Filipinos living within a different context where they have to negotiate their identities and realities all the time. All right. Okay, so this is the statistics of Filipinos living in many parts of the world, like the US, Canada, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and also Australia. I'm sorry, I have to exit very quickly because I have my delivery. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm giving up. Okay. Right, I'm back. I'm sorry about that. My medicine was just delivered. So again, in many parts of the world, Filipino is being constructed as Tagalog, right? So it's deeply rooted in Tagalog being the national language of the Philippines. And many of us speak Tagalog-based Filipino. But then what does it mean, right? When you transport Filipino outside the Philippine context, right? So that's what I would like to share in this particular discussion. So we have American universities offering Filipino. We have the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We have like a Bachelor of Arts in Philippine Language and Culture, and we have the University of Michigan, Cornell, and many others. And you probably heard of Harvard University recently, who's also offering Filipino now, but it's really just a language course, unlike the University of Hawaii, which is the biggest language and culture classes. So we offer a BA. I think we're the only university in the US that offers a BA in Philippine language and culture. And then if you go to Japan, there's also other universities, right, that teach Tagalog or Filipino. And these are just some of the universities on the list. So, and there's many others, by the way, that I not mentioned. These are just representatives of to show you that Filipino is being taught. And of course, when Filipinos travel and then, of course, the children learn Filipino, it's going to be a different experience. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that just like when we are trying to rethink English, right, or mother tongue-based multilingual education in the Philippines, I also want to invite the audience to rethink Filipino. Why? Because Filipino migration is global and sustained across decades. And we know that this started during the martial law period, right? Or after the martial law period, during the administration of Marcos Sr., right? When, the government was encouraging people to actually work abroad, right? And then this migration of Filipinos working abroad never stopped. It's sustained across decades. And in fact, it continues to grow. Migration is not just demographic change. Also, I want to emphasize that when people migrate, like when people move to a different place, it reorganizes language and cultural practices, right? And also including identity formation. So, and that is why this is really important to understand because there's a lot of Filipinos sometimes who make essentialist ideas that Filipinos working abroad or Filipino American students or Filipinos who grew up in the US or in many other places are not Filipinos, right? This can be very contentious and can be very controversial because Filipinos growing abroad, growing up or being born abroad, it's not really their fault, right? And they're actually trying to reconnect to their language, their culture, and their identity. And so to be labeled that they're not Filipino can be very hurtful and marginalizing for these Filipinos. So I want to also emphasize that the diaspora Filipinos constantly negotiate homeland linguistics hierarchies, right? We know that there's this hierarchy in the Philippines where English and Filipino are privileged in many ways, but mostly English is the hegemonic language, right? But then when you come to another country or if you go to another country, there's another linguistic hierarchy. So for instance, if you go to Japan, right, Filipino is very minoritized. It's not even institutionalized in many contexts, right? Because a lot of people don't see the value of learning Filipino, and so there's always this struggle for the for the people, for the community to actually teach the language and culture to the younger generation. So there is that condition, right? It's very important to remember that. And instead of like simply blaming the younger generation of Filipinos abroad, oh, they're not able to speak Filipino, it's their fault. Actually, there's a lot of like things happening within the context of the diaspora that we need to be mindful of and really understand instead of blaming people. Sometimes, I mean, most of the time, it's actually the systems that are at fault, right? Because they're not supportive of community languages to thrive. And so migration, the movement of people, right, from one border geological geopolitics, right? It could be one location to another. It actually challenges monolithic views of language, identity, and pedagogy, right? So this is something very important. You probably heard of hybrid identity. You probably heard of liminal spaces where people, or third space where like for instance, Filipino Americans or Filipino Canadians, they occupy this third space where they can be seen as Filipinos, but at the same time, they're seen as Canadians or Japanese or Americans, right? So again, this challenges monolithic views of language because very often, if when I was in the Philippines, I thought, okay, I'm really Filipino. I don't have to question that. But then for many Filipinos who grew up in the diaspora, very often they challenge or if not, they question their own identity, right? So it's very important as teachers, as policymakers to actually think about these realities because they're also well documented in research. All right, so here's an example of how like Filipino diasporas negotiate the linguistic reality and also hierarchies in their own context. Here's a student saying, um, you know, when I was a child, I knew how to speak Ilocano. But then when I grew up, I lost my proficiency in Ilocano because my classmates laughed at me. I told my teacher, Makaisbuak, meaning I wanted to be in Tagalog, right? This is in Hawaii when he was growing up. And then my teacher didn't understand me. I ended up peeing in my pants. I was so embarrassed. And again, this is trying to recollect the childhood memory that this particular student experienced, right? And then my teacher reported to my parents and discouraged them to speak to me in Ilocano. And since then, I resolved to learn English. So this is just an example of how Filipinos actually, again, negotiate the linguistic hierarchy of the host country or their new land or new home, right? And another important aspect to remember is that the linguistic ecology, the Philippine complex linguistic ecology travels with migrant Filipinos or Filipino immigrants. So we know that there's over 180 Philippine languages, right? And ideally, they should be supported, they should be nurtured. Um, and we have also major languages that function as identity markers. These are, our languages, of course, are very important to our identity development. These languages also serve for regional governance. For instance, in our region, Cebuano is, probably or the lingua franca and also the language of governance, right? And also community communication systems like the radios or broadcasts are mainly in Cebuano or Bisaya. And we also know that Filipino is not the mother tongue for majority of Filipinos. When I say Filipino, this is the Tagalog-based Filipino. And English is historically and institutionally powerful, right? And we know this as well. In fact, that's why we have always this English-only policies in many schools. In spite of the research, there's a lot of research out there saying that this is a very oppressive policy. And again, this is a misinformed policy. But anyway, it's institutionally powerful, and we can always go back to histories of colonialism during the Spanish and American period that really brought linguistic hierarchy in the Philippines, right? It brought about the coloniality of linguistic hierarchy in the Philippine context. And we also need to remember that when Filipinos move to a certain location, let's say Japan or Hawaii, when they arrive, they're already multilingual, right? And continue negotiating language hierarchies abroad, as I pointed out earlier. Now, the question is, for instance, if you're teaching Filipino, like in my case, I was an English teacher back in the Philippines. And so my idea of Filipino was really based on my experience of learning Tagalog-based Filipino in the Philippines. Right? It's so different. However, the question is, how should teachers respond to non-Tagalog words and phrases that students naturally use in Filipino classes? And this is in a chapter that I wrote with my colleague, Lady, who's from Harvard, and Irene, who's from the University of Michigan. We noticed that our students sometimes would pepper their Filipino essays or their conversations in Cebuano Bisaya. They would use certain phrases like "dili ko ambot lagi," which means that at home they're probably learning Bisaya as well. And sometimes I would also hear Ilocano, right? They're using it in our Filipino language classes. So that's one question and something that we have to wrestle with, right? Again, these students are multilingual. Should we ban these words? Yeah? Should we ban Cebuano Bisaya because this is a Filipino class? Or what about when the students are speaking Taglish? Should we also ban them because that's a Filipino class? So another question is, how do we present Filipino as more than just an inherited language? So very common perception is that Filipino is an inheritance, right? And therefore it should be protected. However, we know that multilingual youth actively use and transform and also redefine Filipino, right? They use it in a very dynamic way. They are translanguaging a lot. They're code switching a lot. They're also using their multimodal resources. So nowadays, the youth would use a lot of emojis, memes when they communicate with friends, or if not, when they construct their identities on TikTok or on Facebook, right? So it's not just the language per se, but there are many other multimodal non-linguistic resources out there that are being deployed by multilingual Filipino users in order to actively use, transform, and redefine what Filipino is. Similar to English as well, right? We know that we use emojis and many other signs when we're using the English language. So then the important conversation in the teaching of Filipino is that the national language framing is conceptually limited. So perhaps the national language framing is important in the Philippine context, but then if we move outside the Philippines, we have to expand that perspective. That's very important to remember. So, for instance, when I moved to the University of Hawaii in the past, when I first came here as a Fulbright FLTA in 2011, I noticed that most of the textbook that the professors were using focused mainly on the homeland, right? So their contents were all about the experiences of Filipinos in the Philippines, forgetting that there are Filipinos living in the diaspora, and those experiences should also be included in the curriculum. So my challenge is to actually include materials that are also reflective of the lived realities and experiences of Filipinos in the diaspora, instead of focusing mainly on homeland culture and standard variety of Filipino, right? Because it does affect learners' motivation. I noticed that when students do not see themselves being represented in the textbook, in the materials, or if their language practices are not also being represented in the materials, then their motivation is actually less, right? Or they engage less with the materials because they don't see themselves. And also, it's not so meaningful and relevant to their own realities, right? And then again, many Filipinos many Filipinos in the diaspora context, I'm talking about, again, Filipinos living abroad or studying abroad. And by abroad, I mean they're already based in that region, like for instance, Hawaii, right? California, Japan, right? They may not identify through Philippine nationalism because they don't imagine themselves, as citizens of the Philippines, right? And may also not speak Tagalog-based Filipino at home. Like I mentioned earlier, they could be speaking Kapampangan, or they could be speaking Maranao, or they could be speaking Hiligaynon at home. So how do we deal with that, right? And they may also speak a mix of, let's say, Ilocano and Cebuano, or what if they only speak English at home? So I think we need to imagine what it means to be a Filipino multilingual in the context of the Philippines, but also in the context of the diaspora. And they may learn Filipino as an additional or symbolic language, right? Not necessarily because they are nationalistic, but just because they want to be connected to their culture or to their roots. It can be a symbol of their, let's say, language connection or their cultural connection to the Philippines. So that's something that we need to remember. Again, I'm trying to expand your understanding of language practices and also the lived realities of Filipinos across the world or outside the Philippines, right? Again, there's a lot of research on heritage language learners, and these are Filipino Americans or Filipinos born and raised in the diaspora trying to learn their heritage language. And according to a lot of research, many of them are receptive bilinguals. They can understand, they may be able to understand Tagalog-based Filipino or Ilocano or Cebuano, but they're not able to speak it, right? This is very, very common. But we call them receptive bilinguals because they can understand. They're still bilinguals, right? And then they're also multilingual across home, school, and community because they deploy their linguistic resources in many ways, even if they're just receptive bilinguals, but they're able to translanguage, right, through translanguaging. And again, learning Filipino even if they're not home language. So it's really interesting sometimes when, like, let's say we have an Ilocano descent student learning Filipino, and then they will say, "Oh, wait, my language at home is very different," or if not, Bisaya, Cebuano, and they come to my class and they get confused because I'm teaching the Tagalog-based Filipino, and then as a teacher, how do I support their Bisaya, Cebuano language development, right? So that's something very important to remember. And also they're translanguaging across Filipino original languages, English, and local languages. And when I say translanguaging, they're flexibly drawing on their linguistic repertoire or resources in meaning-making activities, right? So, and we do this all the time. Some of you might be asking me questions later. What is the difference between translanguaging and code switching? Please hold that thought for now, okay? In Hawaii, we have Ilocano visible due to demographics. So there's a lot of Ilocanos here in Hawaii. And so Filipino, Tagalog-based Filipino is often used as a bridge language between Ilocano and Bisaya. So that's the best way for us to understand each other. Or if not, of course, we switch to English if neither of us speak Tagalog-based Filipino. So again, we're talking about multilinguals drawing on their available linguistic resources in order to establish or build community or to create a sense of belonging, right? Which is something very important that Filipinos in the diaspora actually do. And in fact, we really seek that sense of community. If you're living abroad or if you grew up abroad, a sense of community is very important, right? So, and in some of my work, I even expanded Filipino as a diaspora lingua franca. So not just a lingua franca in the Philippines, but again, it is a lingua franca of Filipinos in the US or in many other parts of the world, right? So I combine the ideas of like heritage language teaching scholarship, right? What do we know about heritage language learners? And then what do we know about the diaspora live experience, right? Something very important. Like for instance, they experience a lot of racism, discrimination at work, right? And many of our Filipinos working abroad, their degrees in the Philippines are often not honored in the diaspora context, right? So they have to start from scratch. Like in my case, for instance, I had to finish my PhD in order for me to be acknowledged, or I think my background then becomes strong, right? And so I reconceptualize Filipino just like the concept of English as a lingua franca, right? To say that Filipino as a lingua franca is not territorially bound, meaning it should be flexible, right? It is not owned by native speakers, quote, native speakers, and it serves as a bridge across Philippine languages, right? And it should be open to translanguaging or hybridization and localization. And emergent, it must emerge through diaspora interaction. So this is what I mean by Filipino as a diaspora lingua franca, which is a conceptual paper. So it will come out maybe this year or next year. I just submitted the manuscript of the edited book that with multilingual matters, hopefully. So I want to invite everybody to think that Filipino is increasingly, it increasingly functions as a communicative bridge across global context, right? So again, we think of English as the lingua franca or the common language that is very, very important. But I also want us to think that Filipino is actually an important language that can be used as a communicative bridge across global context, right? So when you meet other Filipinos or ethno-linguistic Filipino groups, when, for instance, another non-Filipino, like this semester, I have a student who's white and she's learning Filipino. And of course, we're using Filipino to understand each other and to connect. And also because she wants to practice and then to support also economic, diplomatic, academic, and social networking. So for instance, in the forthcoming publication of Palma Hill, was based in Japan. In Japan, a lot of let's say workers in diplomatic settings or industries are actually learning Filipino for their work, right? And also for those who are interested in research and also for social networking, they're learning Filipino. And so again, it's not just the English language, but also Filipino. And again, Philippine languages should be treated as important. We also know that our Filipino youth, right, they're very active in social media. They use multilingual and multimodal practices to express fluid identity. When I say multimodal, I mean, not just spoken, right? It can be written. There could be uses of signs, like for instance, memes during the flood control project, right? A lot of our youth are so active in social media, like TikTok, Instagram, and social media storytelling. They also engage in civic engagement, like actively, right? So, Baha sa Luneta, Babae Ako, and these are some of the things where, again, we see translanguaging, and also the use of Filipino in such a way that is very dynamic, in a way that's also reflective of their multilingual realities, right? And I guess earlier also you were playing P-pop, and I know that Ruwani Tupas will be speaking to this audience as well in the future. But yes, definitely P-pop is an example of where Filipino youth is actively using Filipino in such a way that is really engaging and enticing for the youth, right? And of course, the diaspora community building. So if you don't know, I want to share that there's actually a lot of Filipino organizations across the United States. Like in January, I was at the University of Michigan, and the Filipino American Student Organization there organized a Philippine Culture Night. There's also Kasama, there's Katropa, like they have different names for Filipino student organizations across the United States. And that's how they build the community, right? By using Filipino so more flexible. There's no guard keeping or gatekeeping. Sorry, gatekeeping like being strict only with Filipino accent or Filipino standard language. They're very flexible in their use of Filipino. So it's really a lingua franca in many, many ways, which is exciting. And it tells you that the language is dynamic, language is alive, and we should not worry too much about like language death, right? Because as long as the youth are using language or Filipino, then it will survive. I also want to share this, right? Filipino or translanguaging is the norm in the Philippines and also even in the diaspora. So for many of us in the diaspora context, we translanguage a lot. So Filipino language use is dynamic, multimodal, socially embedded, and negotiated across contexts. Here's an example of my students' work, right? So they're using hashtag katulong for too long instead of like hashtag katulong for too long, right? So they're like playing, it's a play on words basically, very creative, and also they're using multimodal resources. They're using drawings or representations of Filipino labor. Then it says here global service is a very strong, critical, and creative message that criticizes like exporting labor, right? Outside the Philippines. And so if I were very strict in saying, okay, we should only use Filipino in this class, I don't think this would have been possible. Like this creative and also critical expression. Um, and also, again, a showing of their critical understanding of what's going on, right? It's very creative, innovative. So in this particular example, translanguaging actually fosters deeper engagement and also critical expression or reflection among my students, because I didn't have a Filipino-only policy. I also didn't have a language-only policy, because I said translanguaging is dynamic, it can be multimodal, right? And so what does this mean, right? As a teacher, then, if we're really reflecting, or if we're really respecting our students' multilingual resources. So it has implications. So I want to briefly talk about translanguaging, right? And perhaps many of you heard of translanguaging before. It is switching in language use between one language to another, or their entire modes of teaching and learning, right? So it could be, an example would be presenting in one language and then allowing the students to produce related information in another language. So this was the old concept of Sen Williams, right? However, again, the examples that I showed you is really drawing on multilingual's rich linguistic and non-linguistic resources. Very important to include that for learning and teaching, because when you're drawing, that could not, perhaps it's not linguistic only, right? Or when you're using memes or other objects to communicate meaning, that's not linguistic. These are semiotic resources. So from this perspective, we look at multilingualism as asset rather than deficit, right? In the context of the Philippines, a lot of people think of multilingualism as a problem. This is really a deficit perspective, which should be, I think, corrected in many ways or resisted. It's very important to think of multilingualism as an asset. And then if we have that perspective, we begin to then reimagine the way we teach, the way we test our students, the way we also use our languages, and then also invest resources in these languages. So I know that I have some limited time, but I'll try to go faster. Um, Another important thing to remember is to validate students' multilingual experiences through pedagogical translanguaging, right? So when I say translanguaging, it has to be carefully planned by the teacher as opposed to spontaneous translanguaging. So for instance, if you're teaching English, the input could be in Filipino because the students can understand Filipino, or it could be in Cebuano. And then they work together, they collaborate so that the output could be in English for subjects like science or MAPE, to help students access content, right? So for instance, when I was a student of biology, I really kind of hated biology because my teacher was always just speaking in English. I wish she had used Cebuano as well to make me understand, like, especially the lesson on the cells, or even like a simple process of like photosynthesis, right? What if content was initially said or delivered in Filipino or Cebuano, so that then comprehension is easier, right? You can access the knowledge or the content more easily, but at the same time, helping the students to then produce English academic language. That would have been really an ideal process. And many of our teachers still struggle to do this because they think that, oh, you know what, English is the only source of knowledge. Again, that's wrong, because knowledge can be produced in any languages. There is knowledge in Cebuano, there is knowledge in our local languages, right? And it's just a matter of making knowledge accessible to our youth. And by doing, how do we do that? By allowing them to access that content through the language that they know, right? So here's another example. The input could be the mother tongue text, right? And then the output could be bilingual summaries. It is if the context is the MTBMLE cycles. Another example of translanguaging, pedagogical translanguaging, is you allow the students to translanguage during the brainstorming, right? Instead of the teacher like moving around, guarding the students or policing the students to speak English, because that will actually, there's a lot of research showing that the ability or the output, the quality of the students diminish dramatically when they are forced to produce only in the target language, especially if their proficiency is not yet that high, right? So it's really detrimental on students' learning if the teachers keep policing their language. So why not allow the students to translanguage during the brainstorming, but at the same time, help them build or develop complexity of academic content during presentations, right? And this then can be done in English. Okay. So, translanguaging is meaning making practice or linguistic theory and multilingual pedagogy dismisses the notion that English or Filipino is a monolithic entity. So it really allows the teachers and the students to deploy and also access knowledge through their linguistic resources more fluidly, right? And it dismantles native speakerism because we allowed the fluid and dynamic use of linguistic resources. At the same time, it also disrupts English only or Filipino only or target language only as monolingual approaches. Um, by the way, I must also share this monolingual approach has been debunked in the field of applied linguistics. I think the monolingual approach was very popular in the 70s and the 80s. And even to some extent in the 90s. But then the field of second language acquisition, bilingual education, applied linguistics have really moved on to say that monolingual approaches are not as productive as multilingual approaches, right? There's a lot of research. Again, if you're familiar with the literature in applied linguistics, monolingual approaches, monolingual policies, these ideas are really old and do not reflect the current understanding of the field, in terms of like teaching and learning additional languages. So as one of the best examples is to show you an example of translanguaging, but this is in Spanish, but I hope you'll get the message.
When a child says, "My mom is planching my clothes," we say, "Oh my goodness, look at you moving the parts of language that you needed." Do you know what you just did? You moved planchando and you moved ironing and you combined them to say planching. I love that. That is fabulous. We want to keep that. We want to sustain that. But we also want to expand your language bubble. So we're going to go ahead and add planchando and ironing so that depending on the context, you can say, "My mom is planching," because we love planching, but you can also move planchando and ironing. "Mi mamá está planchando," or "My mom is ironing my clothes." Mira, translanguaging away.
All right, I really love that example because again, this is a good reminder for teachers that our goal, especially those who want to become a teacher, right? Again, going back to this obsessive corrective pedagogy, we tend to say, "Oh, that's wrong. You're not supposed to say plunging. That is not even a word." Instead of saying that it's wrong, you can actually work with students to expand their linguistic resources. Because in many contexts, right, it could be, let's say, for instance, the Spanish structure of the language can be used or maybe required, and in certain spaces the English structure may be needed as well, but at the same time the student is still able to retain punching or the translanguaging aspect of it. So translanguaging does not dismiss the importance of course, named languages or let's say standard varieties, because again, in many contexts, the system is built still for those language practices, but honoring the translingual realities or translanguaging practices of our students are very, very important. Yeah, so, because by saying that, we're not creating a linguistic hierarchy. We're saying that, okay, that language practice is actually important and it also makes sense and it should be respected, right? Right. So the idea is sustain and expand the language practices of our students. So here's an example. There's a lot of translanguaging happening in the Philippines. For those who attended my lecture before, this is a complete example of that, and it's going to be a very interesting topic. Yeah, so that could be a good, if you have no research for your MA thesis, or perhaps if you're thinking about topic for, I don't know, like a final paper, this is a good topic, like how translanguaging takes place in the linguistic landscapes and in many restaurants or in places, certain spaces in the Philippines, right? So again, translanguaging is everyday multilingualism in the Philippines. It also happens in the diaspora where Filipinos live, whether they are born or raised. Translanguaging is the everyday reality of Filipinos. That's how we connect to our families. That's how we joke. That's how we tell stories, right? It's really an important part of our identity. So why are we banning translanguaging? We should be encouraging it. And our teaching practices should reflect that lived reality, right? That's very important. So there's a pedagogical reorientation that is needed then, right? Instead of like our goal being always the native like speaker, right? Because many teachers are so obsessed with the native like speaker, like sounding American. In the Philippines, American English is the ideal or idealized very often. We should perhaps avoid that and instead expand communicative repertoire. That should be the focus of our pedagogy or our teaching. We should also allow the negotiation of multiple identities, right? And we should encourage, right? People actually have multiple identities. So in certain spaces, you can assert your Cebuano identity. In certain spaces, you can assert your Filipino identity. Or you can also assert you're being an OFW. You know, there are multiple identities, right? So people are complex, and we should again support our students their multiple identities and also help them support navigate intercultural spaces, especially if you work with people from different cultures, right? And also in meaning making social interactions that happen. Again, that should be the focus of our pedagogy or teaching rather than being so obsessed with native like speaker. And here's my message: standard language obsession can produce negative beliefs about student varieties. And there's been studies on that as well. Like, for instance, Revilla 1997 documented that Filipino Americans, they're often told that their accent is funny or wrong and they should just speak English because they don't sound like real Filipinos, right? So it actually really created this negative sense of, identity or linguistic insecurity for a lot of like students every time people make comments of their accent or their grammar. Yeah. So that's important. But there's also curriculum implications, of course. So if you're teaching Filipino in the diaspora context, the curriculum must include diaspora experiences. It should not only talk about Filipinos in the Philippines, we must expand that. So I'm also thinking, like, in your curriculum, I wonder if like how are Filipinos in the diaspora represented in your curriculum? Are the curricula or is the curriculum in the Philippines still focused on overseas Filipino workers? What about other experiences besides being overseas Filipino workers, right? I hope the other lived realities of diaspora Filipinos are also represented in Filipino language curriculum. Also digital literacies, especially now the Filipinos spend so much time on Facebook, right, or TikTok. I hope that we can also include that as well, and multimodal text, right? And of course, we know what linguistic diversity is. In the Philippines, this is very important, especially recently, MTBMLE was abolished, and I think we need to continue to advocate for MTBMLE because, again, there's a lot of research, unfortunately. I don't know why our policymakers, but of course, I know I'm also presenting at AAAL next week in Chicago, and my paper was about why MTBMLE was abolished, and there's a lot of neoliberal ideologies behind that. But again, the curriculum, right, must also reflect real-world communicative context and also even allow the students to investigate language ideologies, especially our beliefs about English or surrounding English, our beliefs surrounding Filipino, our beliefs surrounding our local languages in the Philippines. And we must also learn to reduce monolithic language models because again, these are really old models and they're no longer supported by research and also homeland-only cultural narratives. We should expand our narratives to include the diverse lived experiences of Filipinos in the Philippines, in the diaspora, and many parts of the world, right? That's very important. So this is a paper that I mentioned earlier where the three of us were really thinking about the ambivalences and contradictions of teaching Filipino in the diaspora context because we struggle with this, right? Our students are different. They grew up and they're born in the US. Many of them grew up in the East Coast, like Boston area. We have students who grew up in Michigan. We have students who grew up in California. And how do we negotiate these different experiences and make sure that we actually honor the lived realities of our students? So I also want you to imagine about the different cultures in your own context in the Philippines. There's also assessment implications, of course, right? Instead of like focusing so much on grammar only, like standard pronunciation and native speaker norms, we should also learn to include to assess, like meaning making success, like as long as the students are able to make meaning and successfully, right? That's important. And strategic repertoire use as well. Again, does not necessarily have to be a standard, right? It could also be about multimodal communication. So here's an example. My students work I'm very proud. So instead of like being so obsessed with language only, my students create like flyers, posters. This is about Moreno, Morena, Mestizo, Mestiza. So they use multimodal resources, of course, Filipino, right? And then they also use their knowledge of Philippine history and culture to create flyers about mental health. Of course, they're using Filipino, but they're also using symbols. And they're also freely using English. You probably noticed that in some of the text here in this particular flyer. So what I'm saying is it's very important to assess what matters most. Learners' ability to make meaning, use their full language repertoire strategically, and also communicate with audience awareness and integrate multimodal resources. So in this particular case, I don't obsess with like, again, just grammar or standard variety of Filipino, right? But actually take into account the other multimodal resources and how do they communicate the message through multimodal strategies or elements. So that's something that I want to share. And of course, I know some of you are already using that. You can also foreground multilingual practices in your pedagogy, right? You can encourage students, for instance, to collect. In my case, I encourage them to collect diaspora and Philippine digital texts showing translanguaging or flexible use of linguistic and non-linguistic resources, because sometimes our students here in the diaspora, they think that Filipino is only Tagalog, right? But then if you show them authentic text that Filipino is actually English and also Cebuano, then they realize, oh, wow, it's really not, very, it's not fixed, right? It's very flexible. Yeah. So that's when they realize that, oh, Filipino is very dynamic. I also encourage my students to document Filipino signages, menus. For instance, if they go to Waipaho here in Hawaii, where there's a lot of Filipino restaurants and Filipino grocery stores, in Daly City in California as well. So again, they get to see like how Filipino is being represented on linguistic landscapes or signages that are visible to people. Another example is the multimodal identity production, where students create multimodal social media or visual projects. Like, for instance, we have a Katipunan Club here in Michigan. They have FASA. And on Instagram, if you look at their Instagram, it's very multilingual. It's very multimodal as well. So it's really interesting how they construct their identities and also create their community or sense of belonging through multimodal identity production. Yeah. I'm almost done. This is the end of my slides. So broader implications is that when we think about Filipino or English as a lingua franca, it has broader, it connects to broader language education goals. One is that it challenges monolingual ideology, which is still very pervasive, common, right? And then it also legitimizes diaspora varieties as valid forms of the language and also support multilingual identity formation for many of our students. And of course, we've centered language as social practice. Like when I say language as social practice, it is not just codes, but actually language is how we live and connect with our community, right? So that's something very important when we think of language as social practice. Maraming salamat po. Daghang salamat. Mahalo na Ilua. This is my email address if you want to connect with me. I'm now very happy to entertain questions if you have questions. So thank you so much.
Where are our hosts? Miss Silva?
Okay, Sir Fernan, I think our host is still
All right.
preparing
So
that.
yeah,
So
to
allow me,
continue.
yes,
Yeah,
would
to
you allow
con-
me to start?
yeah. Okay,
moderator.
so to continue for the Q&A and open forum, I'd like to request one of our faculty from the English department, Professor Basma Hussain, to facilitate the question and answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jason Barba, for that very insightful and enriching presentation, no? Especially on Filipino diaspora. We truly appreciate the perspectives you have shared with us today. Now, at this point, we now proceed to the question and answer portion or the open forum. As participants, this is your opportunity to raise your questions, clarifications, or reflections regarding what is being discussed by our first resource speaker. Now, I have already gathered questions here. Allow me to share the questions so that it would be easy to our, okay, resource speaker to read them. Okay.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I didn't.
Okay, is it visible?
Yeah, so this question is
Okay.
actually quite common.
Yes. So, sir, allow me to read the question. Okay,
Sure.
this is from one of our students, Mr. Selwyn Sugilon. Good day, Dr. Jason Parba. Your discussion was truly meaningful, particularly for me, as I am also currently working on a research paper about translanguaging in a classroom setting. Thus, I have done my share of research about the world of linguistic fluidity. Through this, sir, I have learned that it is also undeniable that the opposing side who opposes linguistic fluidity does have a point worth considering. This is because one of the studies I found claimed that translanguaging, despite its various benefits, actually poses great risks, such as dependence on the native language and lowered potential in improving their English proficiency in the Philippine setting, which he believes is a big edge. Now, here is his question. Okay? As you have said, we do want students to feel free using all their languages in class. But the real world, especially in the Philippine context, often still demands perfect, formal English. Thus, by encouraging this fluid way of speaking in school, are we also accidentally making it harder for our students to pass the gatekeepers of the professional world? And if it is, where and how do we draw the line of linguistic fluidity? Or how do we establish balance that welcomes fluidity without the drawbacks?
Right. So I think this is a really good question. This is quite common, right? Where people are worried that when we're allowing translanguaging in our classes, then the students might always just be translanguaging all the time, or that they might not be able to learn standard language. But if you go back to the original book written by Ophelia Garcia and Li Wei, who are major scholars in this field, or who are major proponents of this notion of translanguaging, they do not actually, we're not saying that you should not learn standard English, because again, like I said, the world is there to actually, the reality is the world will demand you to, in certain spaces, to speak standard English, right? But then pedagogical translanguaging is about how do you get there, right? So it does not ignore the fact that, okay, you need to learn, or you need to learn, let's say, standard English, because the world will still demand you, as you mentioned, right? But then what's happening is that in many spaces or in many contexts, the multilingual resources of the students are not used because they're forced to only use English, but it actually limits their potential to learn deeply or master the contents, because teachers are so obsessed with standard English, right? Or the monolingual ideology. The fact is, this idea of, okay, learning English or learning science through English only is, if I may say, comes from this idea of language immersion, which is a really old concept in second language acquisition. We think that the more that we immerse our students to speak English, the more they get better. But the fact is, it does not happen instantly, right? If you studied second language acquisition, it is a field of its own. There's actually an area called second language acquisition. My degree originally was called second language acquisition in my department. It was changed to second language studies to cover it the more broad or the broader context of second language learning and development. But anyway, the idea is that people think that language immersion automatically makes a student good in English. But as you know, there are so many factors that affect one's proficiency in English, right? One important and major factor is resources or social class. You notice that many people who have resources go to good schools. The tendency is they have better or if not, they're highly proficient in English. I'm not like essentializing, but it seems like there's a common trend, right? In my case, for instance, I grew up really in a poor family. My father was a farmer. My mom also works at home. So what I did when I was given the opportunity is to actually read a lot of books, right? And that's only happened when I was given the scholarship. So many schools implement English only policies because they think that the students would automatically speak English or will be good in English if the environment speaks English. But again, there are so many factors, right, that influence language learning. Going back to the question, translanguaging is important as the video I showed you, right? We have to sustain and expand. By sustaining the linguistic practices and the multilingual realities of our students, we're not only nurturing and honoring their identity, and also bridging the gap between home and school, right? So in other words, making content more accessible and also making sure that the students will have a deeper mastery of content. But at the same time, that's why I said, right, it should be carefully planned because in many spaces, for instance, Leeway has a term for it called translanguaging space. So in your context, you can create translanguaging spaces where the students dynamically, fluidly draw on their linguistic resources. But at the same time, there's a time when the students are expected to produce the standard language, right? So it's not an either or situation because even Leeway and Garcia recognize the fact that when we don't teach our students the standard language, then we even further their marginalization, right? So it becomes also a problem. So I think, again, translanguaging should be carefully planned as a teacher. It's not only spontaneous translanguaging. So this is a really good question because this is a very common perspective, and I just want to address this head on. So I hope so when you get the response or at least I answered the question, right? It's not an either or situation. You need to sustain and also expand the linguistic repertoire of your students. And when I say expand, you can, of course, teach the standard language. You can still demand that your students speak, of course, standard English, right? But without dishonoring, right, their linguistic resources, but actually honoring, leveraging on their multilingual realities in order for them to even expand their potential. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Now let's proceed to the next question. At what point does multilingual adaptation within diasporic communities shift from a process of negotiation to one of language loss? And should this shift necessarily be framed as a loss, or might it be more productively understood in another way? This question is raised by Miss Christine Juanites.
Yeah, again, this is an important question, and many people think of language loss as just language loss, or perhaps like it can be very disappointing because perhaps people failed to, let's say, keep their language and their culture, right, in the diaspora. It's so easy to blame Filipino Americans, for example, like, oh, you didn't learn Filipino, it's your fault, or maybe it's the fault of your parents, right? I think we need to reframe language loss as a trace of struggle. It is a trace of struggle for many Filipino Americans or Filipino Canadians, Filipinos in Japan, right, or Filipinos across the world. Um, Sometimes the system is not supportive of their multilingualism, of their language and culture, right? And systems of power is very important, right? They're very important for language maintenance, and also language rights to actually thrive. So I would say that instead of like just labeling it as language loss, it should be a trace of struggle. And sometimes when Filipino parents in the diaspora or Japan would choose Japanese and also English, it's not necessarily because they do not value their language, but it's because they also want to protect their children from racism. So there's so many things going on in the diaspora that we need to learn. Like, for instance, people think that, oh, he's very fluent in English, perhaps he doesn't struggle, right? So maybe some of you think that, oh, like, he probably does not receive or encounter racism. But the fact is, I still encounter racism. I still encounter accent discrimination. Like, even if I speak, at least I speak decent English, I think. And yet sometimes people still stop me in the middle of conversation. I would say, oh, like, where are you born? Where are you from? I can hear an accent. Or they would correct my way of saying things sometimes, when I thought like, oh, I said it correctly or I said it clearly. And can you imagine like Filipino immigrants who did not major in English because, somehow my English has been cleansed, or neutralized because of the speech classes that I took when I was in Xavier. But there's a lot of Filipinos who come to the US, right, without that experience. The thing is, I can resist, I can fight those people who would make comments about my accent and sometimes be racist, right? But for a lot of Filipinos in the diaspora, this is like an everyday experience. This is a very common experience for them, and sometimes they do not know how to resist it. People make fun of their accent. They're discriminated at work because, when they speak, they are misunderstood. And sometimes, even if you're a nurse, if you don't speak English well, or if you have an accent, people will question your expertise if you're a doctor or a teacher. And there's been a lot of research on this, right? So again, language loss is not necessarily a failure of the parents or just language loss per se, but it is a trace of struggle, right? It can also be framed as actually because Filipino parents or the ancestors wanted to protect their children from the racism and discrimination that they experience. They don't want their children or the younger Filipinos to experience those. Yeah. Thank you, Christine, for that really good question. And this is something that I'm very passionate about because I go through this every day. My students share with me a lot of stories about their own, language loss. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for your response to Ms. Juanita's question. To our dear participants, as much as we want to accommodate all your questions, but we can only entertain one last question. Okay, so here is the last question, sir. This question is raised by Farhan Pantao. His question is: despite persistent English only policies in many educational institutions, there is a growing advocacy for multilingualism through translanguaging. My question is: to what extent have we successfully disrupted entrenched monolingual norms in practice? And what evidence from Filipino diaspora classrooms illustrate progress or perhaps persistent gaps?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Monolingual norms are deeply entrenched in many institutions. You can even see that. Unfortunately, we have so many policymakers who, in spite of like listening to experts, right? You probably, like, for instance, during the hearing of the MTBMLE policy and the rollback and the eventual rollback, they actually brought in a lot of experts, right? And then, but then they mentioned, like, in fact, like the new policy says you can only implement MTBMLE in monolingual context. Like, where in the Philippines can you find a monolingual classroom. I mean, maybe but it's just weird to me, like that perception that it's possible to have a monolingual. Like, let's say, for instance, okay, we all speak Cebuano, right, in one classroom, but we're not monolinguals, right? We speak Tagalog-based Filipino as well. We speak English. We speak other languages. And to say that MTV Millie is only possible in monolingual context because they said that by choosing the dominant language in the region to teach students, then multilingual education is exclusionary, right? That was the argument of many policymakers. They think that because, let's say, Cebuano or Bisaya is being taught in this particular classroom, and there are students who speak, let's say, Tagalog, or we have students who speak Hiligaynon, then it's exclusionary to those students, right? So we need to come up with a monolingual classroom. So that's what they said. But for me, it's also very problematic because the new policy even then created a memorandum that says at least 75% monolingual. I said, like, okay, so it's 75% monolingual. Again, they're creating this idea that monolingualism is actually still deeply embedded in the Philippine context, when in fact multilingualism is actually axiomatic. Axiomatic meaning it's the everyday experience of people in the Philippines, right? Um, so um, this question is really hard because I would say that a lot of Filipinos now are very open to multilingualism, like for instance, P-pop, like in different languages, which I really love, by the way. It's beautiful, right? Because again, it reflects our lived realities. I also noticed that there's a lot of people now who are encouraged to write in their mother tongue. Like for instance, I write fictions in Cebuano, and even if I publish a lot in English, my scholarly papers are mostly in English, right? Because it's a publish or perish culture here in the US. So I have to publish in English. However, I continue to write fiction in Cebuano because I really want to support our movement for multilingualism in the Philippines. Because if we do not continue to write in Cebuano, to speak in Cebuano, then our culture will be erased, right? If English becomes it continues to become dominant. So it's really important to respect that. But to what extent have we disrupted monolingual norms? Maybe we created a dent, like it's a really small disruption. And in my paper, which I'm presenting on Saturday in Chicago, I talk about participating in civic engagement, meaning making our scholarship or discussions become more accessible to ordinary people so that then they can become also advocates for multilingualism, and also not just advocates, but really supporting and become like movers of promoting multilingual education. Because I noticed that although we have done a lot of research, like many of us talk about the value of multilingualism, right, to resist monolingual norms, very often it is done in academia or academic spaces, and academic spaces are spaces of elite people. Like, although many of you probably do not identify as elites, but it's actually a privilege to be in academia, right? So I think we need to move the conversation or bring the conversation to ordinary people, regular people, to engage them about the importance of multilingual education and our reality of multilingual, translingual realities in the Philippines, so that they also become active participants in convincing policymakers that, we should continue to support multilingualism rather than continuing the monolingual norms and practices that are so deeply entrenched. Yeah, I'll end my response there. Thank you so much for this good question.
All right. Okay, once again, thank you very much, Dr. Parva, for your thoughtful and informative responses. And to our dear participants, thank you very much for your engaging questions also. Now, okay, with that, I think we conclude the question and answer portion for this session. So I'm now giving the floor back to our host.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And before we officially wrap that up, we would like to briefly acknowledge a small shift that happened during the discussion earlier. Due to some technical limitations, our Q&A had a bit of technical difficulties before it. So We would like to thank Ma'am Basma for stepping in and helping us sustain the discussion together with Dr. Parva. So, but despite those minor adjustments, what remains clear is that the quality of the exchange we witnessed today. The questions were insightful, thank you. The reflections were meaningful, and the conversation itself reflects exactly what this lecture series hopes to achieve. Of course, a space for guiding dialogue, or as we shared earlier, kinagiya. So once again, thank you so much everyone for staying engaged, flexible, and present all throughout. And of course, to Dr. Parba for your responses po. So at this moment, of course, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to our speaker for generously sharing his expertise with us today. So let me read the content of the certificate. All right. Certificate of Appreciation is proudly presented to Dr. Jason Parba in grateful appreciation for sharing his invaluable expertise and insights as the resource speaker during the International Lecture Series on Language Planning and Policies with the theme Diaspora and Transnational Communication in Shaping Language Policy and Multilingual Societies held via Zoom teleconference. Given this 18th of March 2026 at um, Mindanao State University General Santos, signed by, of course, our English chairperson, Professor Fernan Bilehao Maed, and our CSSH Dean, Professor Mario J. Aguja, PhD. So we'd like to request po Dr. Parbat for us to have an photo opportunity together with your certificate po sana. Um, um, can UV take a picture or screenshot? All right. Somebody is already taking a to
Excuse me. Can you split the screen where you can pin the frame of Dr. Parva and the certificate together?
again once
Then you do a screenshot.
all right. Thank you, and Dr. Thankful for your presence here today, gracing us.
Our internet connection says we are still a third world country.
Exactly, sir.
Very sorry for
Moment po,
that,
sir.
Dr. Parva.
Minor glitches.
No, kasabot kayo ko, no problem.
Okay.
All right, can we have another picture of photo opportunity po together with the participants? All right, are we ready now?
Participants, please turn on your camera.
For the information of everyone, we will be having like 5 takes, some picture, because not everyone can be included in one slide. So will it be okay? Take 5. All right. Starting with the first batch. 1, 2, 3. Next. 1, 1, 2, 3. For the third batch. 1, 2, 3. Fourth batch. 1, 2, 3. And the last batch. 1, 2, 3. All right, let's give our virtual hands to our speaker for this morning. And before we conclude today's session, we would like to share a few announcements, Sana. So this is just the start of our international lecture series. Hang on, because we will still be seeing each other again this Saturday, and we will be sending the information later, and featuring our distinguished lecturers. So make sure to save your calendars for Saturday. So any more information will be sent out to your GCs and to your Facebook, or we will be posting them to our Facebook page, which is named again the Kinagiya. So as we come to the end of today's lectures, we hope that this session has sparked new reflections on the role of multilingualism in shaping more inclusive educational spaces. Once again, thank you very much all the way from Hawaii, our speaker, and of course to our organizers here, and to all our participants, of course, who joined us today, to our faculty. And on behalf of the organizing committee, thank you so much for being part of our first ever international lecture series on language planning and policies. So while I'm announcing this, we are currently sending the Google Forms for you to sign out for this session. So see you on Saturday, everyone. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence today. That is all for this morning.
Thank you, Miss Silva. Thank you, Doc Parba. I'll just message you with our token. Hopefully you will meet personally, face to face, when you come to the Philippines. Thank you. Pwede magstay ang mga officers for a while. Let's have a quick ano lang. Mga officers, can you stay for a while?
Yes po, sir. And for the information of the participants, meron po tayong sign out link form sent sa chat box.
Okay, yung iba hindi pa umaalis. Sige lang. So, sige, thumbs up sa atin lahat. This is a good session. Thank you for for living up to the expectation at least. So nakikita natin yung mga difficulties, challenges, not really problems but challenges na nakakaharap natin. Our internet connection first. But I would suggest that we be more prepared next time. This coming Saturday, I think we'll just have a different meeting na lang because there are still a lot of participants here with the officers and the organizers. Parang masyadong mainit yung lugar ni Miss Silva. Anyway, so yeah, probably we'll just have different meeting na lang. I'll schedule probably this evening or tomorrow para mapag-usapan natin ano yung mga kailangan natin i-prepare for the next session. But definitely this is a good session already and we'll just improve it for the next sessions that we will have.